I froze my entire swimming pool solid. Not because I'm crazy, but because my neighbor Karen decided my backyard was her personal business. She wasn't just using my pool, she was running a swimming school in it and making money off my property. When I confronted her, she smirked and said, "The HOA is on my side." Little did she know I had the perfect ice-cold revenge planned. I never thought I'd wake up to the sound of splashing water in my own backyard, especially since I hadn't invited anyone over. At first, I assumed it was my family. Maybe my kids had decided to jump in early, but as I walked closer to the window, something felt off. The voices I heard weren't familiar. There were too many of them, and worse, there was laughter that didn't belong to anyone I knew. My stomach twisted as I pulled back the curtains and looked outside. That's when I saw them. A group of kids were jumping into my pool, kicking water everywhere, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing. And standing there, right at the edge of the pool barking orders like a drill sergeant, was Karen, my nightmare of a neighbor. The same woman who had spent the last few months making my life miserable with petty HOA complaints and condescending remarks. But this was a new level of audacity. She was dressed in an expensive swimsuit, sunglasses perched on top of her nose, a whistle hanging from her neck. She wasn't just using my pool, she was running some kind of private swimming lesson in it. The sight made my blood boil. I stormed outside, footsteps heavy against the pavement, but if Karen noticed, she didn't care. She continued to shout instructions at the kids, cropping her hands, completely at ease in a space she had no right to be in. It was as if she genuinely believed my backyard belonged to her. A few of the kids noticed me and hesitated, but Karen waved them off, telling them to keep practicing. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice sharper than usual. "What the hell is going on here?" Karen turned, a slow, lazy movement as if I was the one intruding. She lifted her sunglasses, looked me up and down, and sighed dramatically. "Oh, it's you," she said, as if she had just realized I existed. "What does it look like?" "I'm holding my swim class." I stared at her, waiting for her to realize how insane that sounded, but she just smiled like she was doing me a favor. "In my pool?" I asked, voice rising. She scoffed. "It's a neighborhood pool." I blinked. "No, it's not. It's mine. On my property." Karen rolled her eyes, completely unfazed. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said. "It's just a pool. Not like you use it all the time. And besides, these kids need a safe place to learn how to swim." I glanced around, noticing for the first time that there were at least a dozen kids in my yard, along with a few parents sitting comfortably on my lounge chairs. My patience snapped. "Get out. All of you." A few parents looked uncomfortable, but Karen just sighed again, shaking her head like I was an unruly child throwing a tantrum. "You're being incredibly selfish," she said, folding her arms. "I spoke with the HOA, and we agree that shared resources should be used for the benefit of the community." My jaw clenched. "This is not a shared resource. This is private property." Karen smiled, but there was something smug about it. "Well, I have permission," she said, pulling a piece of paper from her bag and handing it to me. I snatched it and skimmed through. It was an HOA document, but as I read it, I realized it was completely unrelated to the situation. It mentioned something about community spaces, but had nothing to do with my pool. "This doesn't mean anything," I said, tossing it back at her. She clicked her tongue. "I knew you'd be difficult about this." She turned to the parents, gesturing toward me. "See? This is exactly why we need to make sure everyone understands the rules. Some people just don't know how to share." One of the parents gave me an apologetic look and quickly grabbed their kid, hurrying off my property. But the rest, they just sat there, waiting to see what would happen. I pulled out my phone. "All right then, if you're not leaving, I'm calling the police." For the first time, Karen's expression faltered, but only for a second. Then she smirked. "Go ahead," she said. "I have connections with the HOA board. They'll just tell the cops it's a misunderstanding, and you'll end up looking like the bad guy for refusing to let kids swim." I hesitated. As much as I hated to admit it, she had a point. I'd seen how the HOA operated, corrupt, biased, and always siding with Karen. If I called the cops, there was a chance they would brush it off as a civil matter and tell me to take it up with the HOA. I needed a different approach. Instead of calling, I turned on my camera. All right, I said, voice calm. Since you have nothing to hide, I'm just going to record this. You know, for documentation purposes. Karen's smirk wavered. Oh, don't be ridiculous, she said, waving her hand dismissively. I kept the camera rolling. So, just to clarify, you're admitting that you're using my pool without permission? That you invited all these people onto my private property without my consent? Karen hesitated. She glanced around, realizing that a few parents were now shifting uncomfortably. They had been fine when it was just a neighborhood dispute, but the second things started getting recorded, they weren't so sure. One of the kids shivered. Miss Karen, it's kind of cold, she said. Karen forced a smile. All right, class dismissed for today, she said quickly, waving her hand. We'll continue tomorrow. I took a step forward. No, you won't. She turned to me, that smugness black in her eyes. Oh, I absolutely will, she said. Unless you want to deal with some hefty HO fines for denying access to a community resource. I clenched my fists, watching as she started off with the remaining kids. The parents gathered their belongings, some apologizing if they left. But Karen, she didn't care. As she walked away, she tossed one last remark over her shoulder. See you tomorrow. I stood there seething, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, I sat in my living room, going over my options. The usual methods wouldn't work. I couldn't rely on the police, and the HOA was clearly on Karen's side. I needed to do something that would send a message, something that would make it crystal clear that my pool was not public property. And then it hit me. A slow grin spread across my face as the idea formed. If Karen wanted to use my pool so badly, I was going to make sure she got exactly what she asked for, just not in the least she expected. But before I could put my plan into motion, I needed to know just how deep this corruption ran. If Karen was bold enough to walk into my backyard and run a swim school out of my pool, it meant she believed she had real power. And that meant I had to figure out exactly who was backing her. I decided to start with the HOA. I had never been particularly involved with their meetings, mostly because I assumed they were just a bunch of nosy neighbors who liked making unnecessary rules. But now I realized that ignoring them had been a mistake. If I wanted to take down Karen, I had to play the game on her level. So that morning, I walked into the HOA office, expecting to have a civil discussion. Instead, I was met with smug smiles and condescending stares. The HOA president, a balding man with thick glasses and a permanent frown, barely looked up when I entered. You must be here about the pool situation, he said, shuffling some papers on his desk like he already knew where this conversation was headed. I folded my arms. Yeah, I want to know why one of my neighbors thinks she has the right to use my private property for her personal swim lessons. He let out a long sigh, like I was wasting his time. Well, according to the community guidelines, all shared amenities should be accessible for neighborhood use. I narrowed my eyes. My pool is not a shared amenity. He gave me a patronizing smile. That's where we disagree. I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my temper in check. No, that's where facts disagree with you. My pool is inside my property line. It's not part of any community space. He shrugged. The way we see it, a pool of that size benefits the neighborhood, and it would be unfair to deny others the chance to use it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So let me get this straight. I paid for my pool, I maintain my pool, I pay the water and electricity bills for my pool, but you're telling me that because it's big enough to be useful, it's no longer mine. He nodded, completely unfazed. That's exactly right. I took a deep breath, trying to control the growing rage inside me. And what about Karen? She's not just using my pool, she's profiting from it. She's running a business in my backyard. He waved a hand dismissively. Karen is providing a valuable service to the community. Parents trust her to teach their kids to swim. It's a win-win situation. I stared at him, realizing that arguing was pointless. They weren't going to change their minds because they had already decided I was the problem. This wasn't about fairness. It was about control. Karen had somehow convinced them that she had more rights to my pool than I did, and as long as they were backing her, she wasn't going to stop. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. You know this is illegal, right? You can't just claim someone's private property as a shared resource. The HOA president smirked. Then take it up with the board. That's when it clicked. They weren't just ignoring the rules. They were making new ones to benefit themselves. And Karen, she wasn't just some entitled neighbor. She had connections. I needed proof. I spent the next few days digging into the HLA's past decisions. At first, it seemed like standard community management, rules about lawn maintenance, pet restrictions, parking regulations. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized how many of these rules seemed to benefit a select group of people, specifically Karen. She had managed to get ridiculous fines waived, complaints against her dismissed, and even had the HOA cover expenses for landscaping work in her yard under the excuse of neighborhood beautification. But the real kicker? I found out that last year, she had submitted a request for a pool to be built in her backyard, and the HOA had denied it, citing community aesthetic standards. That was when everything made sense. Karen wanted a pool but couldn't get one, so she had found a way to take mine instead. And the HOA, they had let her do it because they had something to gain. Maybe it was money, maybe it was favors, but either way, they had no intention of stopping her. I decided to take matters into my own hands. First, I installed security cameras all around my backyard, making sure to capture every angle of the pool. If Karen wanted to keep trespassing, I was going to document every second of it. Then I posted clear signs that read private property and no trespassing. I even had a lawyer draft a cease and desist letter, which I personally delivered to Karen's door. She opened it, skimmed through, then laughed. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "You're really making a big deal out of nothing." I stepped closer. "This is a legal warning, Karen. Next time you or any of your students set foot in my pool, I will press charges." She smirked. "Go ahead. I have friends on the HLA board, remember? They'll handle it." That was the last straw. I realized that as long as Karen thought she was untouchable, she would never stop. So I decided to make sure she felt the consequences. The next morning, I checked my security footage. Sure enough, Karen had torn down my signs and resumed her lessons as if nothing had happened. That was all I needed. I compiled the footage, including the part where she ignored the cease and desist letter, and sent it to my lawyer. I also sent copies to local news outlets, social media, and even a few legal groups that specialized in HLA corruption pieces. Then I took things one step further. I started speaking to my neighbors, especially the ones who had been fined unfairly by the HOA. As it turned out, I wasn't the only one who had been screwed over by their ridiculous policies. People were angry, and once they saw the proof of what was happening, they were ready to fight back. Karen didn't realize it yet, but her days of unchecked entitlement were numbered. That evening, as I sat on my back porch watching the sunset over my pool, I felt something I hadn't in a long time control. I knew Karen wasn't going to back down without a fight, but that was fine because now I had a plan. And when I was gone, she wouldn't just be banned from my pool, she'd be the one drowning in consequences. I woke up early the next morning with a renewed sense of determination. The previous night, I had gone over every possible way to get rid of Karen and her entitled pool scam, but everything led to the same conclusion: she wouldn't stop unless she was forced to. And with the HLA backing her, normal methods weren't going to work. I needed something more, something that would make her regret ever stepping foot on my property. That was when the idea came to me. If Karen wanted to use my pool so badly, I was going to make sure she got exactly what she asked for, just not in the way she expected. I grabbed my phone and made a few calls. It took some effort, but eventually I found exactly what I needed: a local ice distributor that had the capability to deliver massive quantities of ice blocks on short notice. After explaining my ridiculous but urgent request, they agreed to bring several truckloads to my house later that evening. It wasn't cheap, but at this point I didn't care. The satisfaction of watching Karen's reaction would be worth every penny. By the time the sun had set, I was outside overseeing the delivery. The workers looked at me like I was crazy, but they did as I asked, dumping enormous blocks of ice directly into the pool. The water began to chill instantly, and within minutes, the entire surface was covered in a thick layer of floating ice chunks. The once inviting blue water now looked like something straight out of the Arctic. It was perfect. I took my security cameras to make sure they were working. Everything was set. Now all I had to do was wait. The next morning, I didn't have to wait long. Right on schedule, Karen arrived with her students and their parents. She walked into my backyard as if she owned the place, completely ignoring the massive and no trespassing signs I had put up again. Karen set up their chairs. Kids started running toward the pool, and Karen blew her whistle, signaling the start of her class. Then it happened. The first kid jumped in, expecting the usual warm water. The second his body hit the ice-cold pool, he let out a scream so loud it echoed through the neighborhood. He flailed, scrambling out of the water as fast as he could. Karen barely had time to react before the next child jumped in and had the exact same reaction. Parents started rushing forward, confused and panicked, trying to figure out what was wrong. Then Karen, looking increasingly irritated, stepped up to the edge of the pool and dipped her toes in. The second she felt the freezing temperature, she yelped and jumped back, nearly slipping in the process. Her face twisted in confusion, then rage, as she turned toward my house. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. Karen stomped toward me, her wet footprints marking the pavement. "What the hell did you do to the pool?" she demanded, shivering. I gave her my most innocent smile. "Oh, nothing. Just a little maintenance." Decided to try out a new cooling system. She gritted her teeth, her cheeks red not from embarrassment, but from the sheer cold. "This is sabotage. You did this on purpose." I shrugged. "It's my pool. I can do whatever I want with it." The parents around her, now realizing what had happened, were beginning to whisper among themselves. Some of them were just annoyed at the freezing water. They were starting to question why they were even here in the first place. One of them, a mother with a towel wrapped tightly around her daughter, turned to Karen. "Wait a second, you told us this was a community pool." Karen's face paled slightly. "It is," the HOA said. Another father, now visibly angry, cut her off. "The HOA? This guy just froze his own pool. This doesn't look like something a community pool owner would do. Have you been lying to us?" Karen's eyes darted between me and the group of parents, her usual smug confidence starting to crack. She tried to regain control. "Look, this is obviously just some childish prank. Don't listen to him. We'll be back next week when this nonsense is over." I chuckled. "Oh, don't worry, Karen. The ice isn't going anywhere. In fact, I was thinking of making this a permanent thing. Ice baths are all the rage these days, you know." One of the parents scoffed and grabbed his things. "Yeah, I'm not bringing my kid back here. This is ridiculous." Others nodded in agreement, collecting their towels and muttering to each other as they started leaving. Karen, now watching her so-called students walk away one by one, looked like she was about to explode. She turned back to me, her voice shaking with rage. "You're going to regret this." I tilted my head. "Am I? Because it seems to me that your little business just lost all its customers." She clenched her fists, her entire body trembling from a mix of cold and fury. Without another word, she stormed off, her whistle still hanging uselessly around her neck. I let out a breath, watching as the last of the parents and kids disappeared down the street. It was over. The ice plan had worked even better than I expected. Not only had I completely shut down her ridiculous swim school, but I had also exposed her lies to the people she had been scamming. That evening, as I sat by the now empty pool, I checked my security footage. The entire thing had been recorded, Karen's entitled entrance, the shocked screams, the growing realization that she had been caught. I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. The next morning, I uploaded the footage online. Within hours, it started gaining traction. People loved watching an entitled HLA Karen get what she deserved. Comments poured in, with users praising the way I had handled the situation, some even suggesting new ideas for how to keep her out permanently. It wasn't long before the video reached the wider neighborhood. By the afternoon, people were talking. I started getting messages from neighbors, some laughing at Karen's meltdown, others thanking me for exposing how she and the HOA had been manipulating the community. It seemed like I wasn't the only one who had been screwed over by their ridiculous policies. But the best part? The HOA couldn't ignore this. With the video circulating, they had no choice but to respond. That night, I received an email from them. It was a formal notice stating that Karen was no longer authorized to conduct any community-related activities involving my pool. I laughed out loud. It was a pathetic attempt to save face, but it was confirmation that they knew they had lost. As for Karen, she didn't show her face for the next few days, but I knew this wasn't the end. She wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. That was fine, because if she wanted to escalate things, I was more than ready. Karen was nowhere to be seen for the next few days, and for the first time in what felt like forever, my backyard was peaceful. The pool sat undisturbed, no uninvited children splashing around, no shrill whistles cutting through my mornings. It was exactly how things should have been from the start. But I knew Karen well enough to know that she wasn't the type to dock down without a fight. She was plotting something. I could feel it in my gut. My suspicion was confirmed when I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox from the HOA. The moment I saw the envelope, I already knew it was trouble. I tore it open and read through it quickly, my frustration growing with every word. The HOA was now accusing me of creating a neighborhood disturbance and deliberately making shared community resources unusable. They were actually trying to find me for what I had done to my own pool. I let out a humorless laugh. So this was Karen's next move. Since she couldn't intimidate me directly, she had decided to use the HOA to do it for her. I wasn't about to let her win. Instead of responding to the notice, I took it straight to my lawyer, the same one who had helped me draft the cease and desist letter. He barely glanced at the paper before shaking his head. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said. "This is an obvious abuse of power." That was exactly what I needed to hear. I sent an official response back, making it clear that any attempt to find me over my private property would result in legal action. I copied the entire HOA board on the email, ensuring that they knew I wasn't playing around. Less than 24 hours later, I received a new email from the HOA president. The fine had been reconsidered and was no longer applicable. I knew that wasn't the end of it. Karen wasn't just after my pool. This was about control. She had spent so long getting her way that the idea of someone standing up to her was unbearable, and she wasn't just going to let it go. Sure enough, the very next morning, I saw her lurking outside my house. She wasn't alone this time. 2 HOA board members stood beside her, dressed in their usual fake professionalism. I stepped outside before they even had a chance to knock, crossing my arms as I looked at the 3 of them. Karen gave me a tight-lipped smile. "We need to have a discussion." I tilted my head. "About what?" One of the HOA members, a short woman with an oversized clipboard, cleared her throat. "There have been multiple complaints about your behavior toward other community members," she said in a practiced, robotic tone. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who exactly has been complaining?" She hesitated. Karen quickly jumped in. "You've been harassing neighbors, creating unnecessary drama, and refusing to cooperate with the HOA's decisions." I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. "You mean the same HOA that tried to claim my pool as public property?" The other board member, a tall, thin man who looked like he hadn't smiled in years, gave a stiff nod. "We're here to find a solution that works for everyone." I leaned against my door frame, staring at them for a long moment. "Here's my solution. Karen stays off my property. End of discussion." Karen scoffed, crossing her arms. "That's not going to work." I smirked. "Then I guess we don't have anything to talk about." The clipboard woman shifted uncomfortably. "We'd rather not escalate this into something more serious." I let out a short chuckle. "More serious than trespassing, unauthorized business operations, and HOA corruption?" Karen's face twisted with barely contained fury. You think you're so smart, don't you? She snapped. This isn't over. You might have won this little battle, but I promise you, I'll get the last word. I sighed. Karen, you already lost. You just haven't accepted it yet. She glared at me for a few more seconds before turning on her heel and storming off. The two HOA members hesitated before following her. I watched them go, shaking my head. Later that evening, I checked my security footage again, just to make sure everything was still in place. The cameras had captured the entire interaction on my porch, just like they had captured every other stunt Karen had pulled. I saved the file, knowing that it might come in handy later. I had expected Karen to try something new, but I wasn't prepared for just how desperate she was willing to get. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of loud, aggressive banging on my door. When I opened it, I found two police officers standing on my porch. "Good morning," one of them said. "Are you the homeowner?" I nodded. "Yeah, what's going on?" The other officer glanced at his notes. "We received a report of public endangerment involving a body of water on your property." It took me half a second to realize what was happening. Karen had actually called the cops on me. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Let me guess, the pool?" The officer nodded. "We have a report stating that you've made it hazardous and that it's posing a risk to children in the neighborhood." I almost laughed. This is Karen's master plan? Calling the police because I made my own pool too cold for her liking? I stepped aside. "Feel free to take a look." The officers walked past me and into the backyard. The pool, still partially covered in ice, sat undisturbed, exactly as I had left it. One officer knelt down and examined the water. "This is just ice." I nodded. "That's right. I never invited anyone to use my pool. Karen and her so-called swim class were trespassing. She didn't like that I stopped her, so now she's making up complaints." The officers exchanged glances. It was clear they thought the whole situation was ridiculous. "Well," one of them finally said, "as far as we're concerned, you haven't broken any laws. Your pool is on private property, and you can do whatever you want with it." I smiled. "Would you mind writing up a report saying that? Just in case she tries anything else." The officer nodded. "Absolutely." As they left, I noticed Karen standing across the street, watching the entire exchange. The second she realized I was looking at her, she turned and walked away. That was the moment I knew I had one. She had pulled every trick she could think of, manipulating the HOA, gathering fake complaints, even calling the cops, and none of it had worked. She was out of options. That evening, I sat outside with a drink in hand, watching the sunset reflect off the now peaceful water. No uninvited guests, no entitled demands, just me and my property, exactly as it should have been all along. Karen had lost, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely and utterly victorious. The next morning, I woke up expecting some sort of retaliation from Karen, but the neighborhood was unusually quiet. No kids screaming in my backyard, no entitled voice-barking demands at my front door, and no ridiculous HOA letters trying to fine me for existing. It was almost unsettling. After everything she had pulled, I couldn't believe she had actually given up. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Karen wasn't the type to go down without trying to take everyone else with her. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood just to see if anyone had heard anything. It didn't take long before I ran into one of my neighbors, an older woman named Margaret who had lived here longer than most of us. She had always been friendly but tended to stay out of HOA drama. This time, however, she had a knowing smirk on her face the moment she saw me. "I heard Karen's little stunt with the cops didn't work out the way she planned," Margaret said, shaking her head in amusement. "She was furious when she got back home." I chuckled. "Yeah, she really thought she could get me in trouble for putting ice in my own pool." Margaret let out a snort. "Well, it looks like that was the final straw. Word is, she's been ranting to anyone who will listen about how unfairly she's been treated. She even went to the HOA board demanding that they do something, but after everything that's happened, no one wants to be associated with her anymore." That caught my interest. "What do you mean?" Margaret's smirk widened. "Well, Apparently, some of your neighbors didn't appreciate being lied to about your pool being a community resource. Once they saw that video you posted, they started questioning other decisions the HOA has made. You're not the only one who's had problems with them, you know. I hadn't considered that before, but it made sense. Karen wasn't the only entitled HOA member around here, and if she had been getting away with things, it meant others probably had too. Now that people were paying attention, the HOA couldn't just sweep it under the rug. Later that day, I got an email from the HOA president. At first, I thought it was another pathetic attempt to intimidate me, but when I opened it, I was pleasantly surprised. The message was short and formal, stating that after a thorough review of recent events, the board had decided to remove Karen from any position of influence in the HOA. While she was still technically a resident, she no longer had any authority, and any further complaints from her would be treated as personal disputes rather than community matters. I couldn't stop the grin that spread across my face. It was exactly what I had been hoping for. Without the HOA backing her up, Karen had no real power. She was just another neighbor now, and if she tried to pull anything else, she'd have to deal with me directly. Something told me she wasn't going to risk that again. A few days passed, and the neighborhood seemed to settle down. No more surprise HOA visits, no more entitled parents thinking they had a right to my property. I finally got to enjoy my own backyard without worrying about someone sneaking in to use the pool. But then something unexpected happened. One evening, as I was sitting outside, sipping a drink and watching the water ripple under the fading sunlight, I heard a familiar voice. "Enjoying yourself?" I turned my head and saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, an expression of pure bitterness on her face. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she didn't have that smug confidence she usually carried. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone casual. "Yep, it's nice to finally get some peace and quiet." She scoffed. "You think he won, don't you?" I shrugged. "Don't think. No." Karen's hands clenched into fists, but she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she let out a deep breath and shook her head. "I hope you're happy. You ruined everything for me." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean I ruined your little business that was illegally using my property?" "Yeah, I guess I'm pretty happy about that." She glared at me. "You just had to be difficult, didn't you? Couldn't just let it go." I let out a short laugh. "Karen, you've broke into my backyard, ignored multiple warnings, used my pool without permission, made money off it, and then tried to get the HOA and police to intimidate me. What exactly was I supposed to let go?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked over at the pool, almost wistfully, like she was realizing for the first time that she was never going to have control over it again. Then, with a final huff, she turned around and walked away without another word. I watched her go, sick in my head. A week later, I'd heard the news from Margaret. Karen had put her house up for sale. Whether it was out of embarrassment, frustration, or sheer spite, she was leaving. I wasn't sure if she had been pressured out by the HOA's new scrutiny or if she just couldn't stand living in a neighborhood where she no longer had control, but either way, I wasn't complaining. The day she moved out, I sat on my porch with a cold drink in hand, watching as the moving trucks hauled away her belongings. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't even look in my direction. By the time the last truck pulled away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, complete and total victory. That night, some of the neighbors decided to throw an impromptu gathering, almost as if celebrating Karen's departure. I wasn't usually one for social events, but I made an exception this time. People shared stories about their own run-ins with Karen and the HOA, laughing over how ridiculous some of the rules had been. It was clear that I wasn't the only one who had been dealing with her nonsense. At one point, someone jokingly suggested that I should fill the pool with ice again, just for old time's sake. I laughed, shaking my head. "Nah," but I kept the receipt, just in case someone else tries to pull the same stunt. The night ended with everyone in good spirits, and as I walked back home, I took one last look at my backyard. The pool shimmered under the moonlight, completely and utterly mine. No entitled neighbors, no chilly harassment, no unwanted swim lessons, just peace. As I closed the door behind me, I realized something. This whole ordeal, as frustrating as it had been, actually worked in my favor. Not only had I gotten rid of Karen, but I had also exposed the HOA's corruption, gained the respect of my neighbors, and, most importantly, reclaimed my own home. In the end, I hadn't just won. I had made sure that no one would ever dare to mess with me again. And that was the most satisfying victory of all.